Two men lived on the same street in 2007. Every morning, Daniel left his modest suburban home at exactly 7:15 a.m. He wore a pressed shirt, carried a leather briefcase, and drove the same reliable sedan he'd financed 5 years earlier. He had done everything right: a stable job, a mortgage, a retirement account slowly building in the background. He was, by every definition, middle class. 3 houses down, Marcus lived very differently. His income fluctuated wildly. Some months he made nothing, other months more than Daniel made in a year. He owned no traditional home, no long-term mortgage. Instead, he moved between properties, buying, selling, and leasing in ways most people didn't quite understand. Then, 2008 happened. Within a year, Daniel lost his job. Within 2, he lost his house. His retirement account shrank by nearly 40%. Everything he had spent decades building began to unravel in a matter of months. Marcus, on the other hand, became significantly wealthier. He didn't panic.
He didn't sell. He didn't tighten his budget. Instead, he started buying cheap properties, distressed assets, entire blocks that people like Daniel were being forced to give up. 2 men, same economy, same crisis, completely different outcomes. Most people think this means one was smarter or luckier. It doesn't. What it actually reveals is something far more unsettling. The middle class is not just vulnerable during economic collapse. It is structurally designed to be the first group wiped out. We are taught to believe that the middle class is the safest place to be, not poor enough to struggle, not rich enough to take extreme risks, stable, responsible, protected. But this belief is built on a misunderstanding of how economic systems actually function. Here's what nobody tells you. The middle class doesn't collapse by accident. It collapses by design, because it holds its wealth in the exact form that crises are engineered to destroy: savings, salaries.
Fixed assets financed with debt. These feel safe, predictable, logical. But this is where it gets dangerous. They are also the most fragile forms of wealth in a system that is constantly shifting beneath the surface. The data reveals something surprising. Across nearly every major financial crisis in modern history, the pattern is the same. The poor lose income. The rich lose temporarily on paper. But the middle class loses ownership. And this is the key. Loss of ownership is the real collapse. To understand this, you have to see the system differently. Not as a place where everyone is playing the same game, but as a layered structure where each class holds wealth in a different form, and each form reacts differently under stress. This is what we can call the wealth exposure ladder. At the bottom, the poor rely on income. When crises hit, they lose jobs. At the top, the wealthy rely on assets. When crises hit, asset prices fluctuate, but ownership remains.
But in the middle, something more dangerous happens. The middle class relies on leveraged ownership: mortgages, loans, retirement accounts tied to markets they don't control. And when pressure enters the system, leverage doesn't protect, it amplifies. The first pattern appears in what we can call the leverage trap. In 2008, the United States housing market collapsed. Millions of middle-class families owned homes, but they didn't truly own them. They owned obligations. Adjustable-rate mortgages began to reset. Monthly payments increased. At the same time, home values fell. This created a devastating equation. People owed more than their homes were worth and could no longer afford the payments. Here's what nobody tells you. Over 6 million American households faced foreclosure between 2007 and 2010. Entire neighborhoods were emptied. But this is where it gets dangerous. The houses didn't disappear. They changed hands. Institutional investors and private buyers began purchasing these properties at massive discounts.
History shows this again and again. When leverage collapses, ownership transfers, and the middle class sits directly at the center of that transfer. The takeaway is simple. If your ownership depends on debt, it is not ownership. It is conditional access. Now shift to Germany, 1923. Hyperinflation destroyed the value of the German mark. Prices doubled in days, then hours. Middle-class families had savings, cash reserves, fixed incomes. They believed they were protected. But the data reveals something surprising. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200 billion marks by November. Savings didn't shrink, they evaporated. But this is where it gets dangerous. The wealthy didn't hold cash. They held assets, land, businesses, hard goods. As currency collapsed, those assets retained relative value. And this is the key. Inflation doesn't destroy wealth equally. It targets stored value. The middle class stores value in currency. The wealthy store value in ownership. This same pattern appears in Argentina in 2001. Bank accounts were frozen. Withdrawals were limited. The currency devalued rapidly. Middle-class savers were trapped. Meanwhile, those holding assets, real estate, foreign currency, commodities, adapted. The takeaway becomes unavoidable. If your wealth is stored in a system-controlled unit, you do not control your wealth. The third pattern is what we can call the liquidity illusion. During crises, the middle class believes it can access its wealth. Savings accounts, retirement funds, equity. But this is where it gets dangerous. Access is not guaranteed. In Argentina, citizens were locked out of their own bank accounts. In Greece, during the 2015 debt crisis, withdrawal limits were imposed. In Cyprus, in 2013, bank deposits were directly seized to stabilize the financial system. Here's what nobody tells you. Liquidity is conditional. And conditions change fastest during crisis. The data reveals something surprising. The assets people believe are safest are often the least accessible when they are needed most. And this is the key. The middle class depends on systems to access wealth. The wealthy structure ownership to bypass those systems. This same pattern appears in every crisis. Access disappears before value does. The fourth pattern is what we can call the timing gap. Crises do not affect everyone at the same speed. The middle class reacts late. Not because it is unaware, but because it is anchored. Jobs, mortgages, social expectations. These create friction, and friction delays action. Meanwhile, the wealthy operate differently. They are mobile, liquid, strategic. They act early, before the crisis becomes obvious. In 2008, major institutional players began reducing exposure months before the collapse became visible to the public. By the time the middle class reacted, the window had already closed. History shows this again and again. The advantage is not information, it is timing. And timing is controlled by flexibility. The takeaway is clear. If you cannot move quickly, you will always move too late. Now, step back. Across all these patterns, leverage, inflation, liquidity, timing, a single principle emerges. The middle class is not simply unlucky, it is positioned. Positioned to absorb the initial shock, positioned to hold vulnerable forms of wealth, positioned to transfer ownership when pressure hits the system. And this is the big insight. Economic collapse is not just destruction, it is reallocation. We can call this the ownership transfer cycle. Wealth doesn't disappear, it moves. From leveraged holders to liquid buyers. From system-dependent savers to system-independent owners. From the middle to the top. Now, bring this into the present. The system is changing again. AI is transforming labor markets. Automation is reducing the stability of traditional careers. Asset prices continue to rise faster than wages in many parts of the world. Here's what nobody tells you. The middle class is becoming increasingly exposed to the same patterns. High debt,
asset inflation, wage stagnation. But this is where it gets dangerous. The next shift may not look like 2008. It may be slower, more subtle, more structural, fewer dramatic crashes, more silent erosion. The data reveals something surprising. In many economies, home ownership rates among younger generations are declining, savings rates are under pressure, and access to high-performing assets is becoming more concentrated. History shows this again and again. When systems evolve, those who adapt early preserve wealth. Those who don't become part of the transition. So what does this mean? It means the question is not whether crises will happen. They always do. The question is how your wealth is positioned when they do. Are you holding value in forms that depend on stability?
Or in forms that survive instability? Are you relying on access or ownership? Are you reacting or positioning? Because this is the key. The middle class doesn't fall first because it is weak. It falls first because it is exposed. You thought this was about the middle class. It's not. It's about how the system determines who keeps ownership and who gives it up. If you want to understand this at a deeper level, you need to start seeing patterns, not events. You need to stop asking what is happening and start asking why it repeats. Because once you see the pattern, you don't just survive the cycle. You step outside of it.